Hi, so it's day 17 and I'm still recovering at the hotel in Mumbai. I think that things are going actually quite well in my recovery. I've also noticed, some overlapping layers of symptoms. I obviously, as I've said, my vision has a long way to go. There's some balance and coordination, and it's an interesting piece kind of observing myself. Um, when it comes to like the walking and coordination. So the biggest piece that has, dramatically improved is the paralysis. And it's an interesting one because when the paralysis would come on, I wouldn't really have a lot of indications prior. Like I could, I started to learn after it happened regularly, like, hey, if you're upright for very long, if you're doing these certain things, or if you're in a car, or if you're walking on something wobbly or unstable, like that would happen. But in general, when I was first having it more regularly, I couldn't feel something, right? Like I didn't feel tired in my body or my muscles. It just started happening. Like I'd get out of the car and then next thing I know, my legs were fully crumpling under me and I'm like, okay, it's happening. Or yeah, it was, a lot of it was like leg drops. A lot of it was also like the muscles that kind of hold your hip together. I think that, a Barbie doll is like this, and if you grab the bottom of her leg, which would be my nail, she goes like this. Instead, up where, now I can't point, up here, those hips would go out, away, and it wouldn't hold. And it was just such a strange thing, and I didn't know. Anyways, so as I'm walking, around the room here, I get these little things where my knees wobbly or locks, or I'm kind of uncoordinated in my legs, and it's an interesting thing to kind of be in recovery and observation where, when that stuff used to happen before originally, I just was like, okay, well, I don't know, so I should just keep moving on, or like, oh, I don't know, so I should just like, make sure I do healthy things when I can, because sometimes I can't control my legs. And I had the necessity of coping by trying to just be calm and not worry about it, but take care of it. Whereas now, I not only know it to an extreme, because I've lived that, it's much better, it's better, but I also have the knowledge of like, oh, I know what that was. So as those symptoms happen, it's an interesting piece to be like, okay, like, well, I think it's okay. I think that my body has a lot of healing to do. I think there's a lot of rebooting to do. I think there's practical things when you do a bone graft. All of those lower muscles in the leg get really irritated. I also know that to have my left leg, because my left leg was worse for the paralysis, not functioning as it should, those muscles adapted. They don't work in sync together. Like it's like someone, put me together with two people's legs in a sense. And so just really interesting kind of going through this process and being in real time with myself, because, here I am again where I'm like, I have all this knowledge, I have this experience, I've had this surgery, there are no guarantees. I think it's okay. But in the past, that was kind of an under response, whereas now I have the knowledge, but I also think, you know, I think it's okay to wait and see. I think it's okay to think, yeah, it's probably fine and not be stressed out about it. But if something occurs more, I'll figure it out then. I'll respond then. And I kind of was thinking about like, well, why am I like that? Why am I pretty comfortable with that? And I think it's like it's something that's developed in me out of necessity, like having like quite a lot of pretty intense neurological symptoms even earlier on, even when I could kind of come out into the world for a bit and then go back and crash out. I kind of learned to like say as little as possible. I learned to say as little as possible, particularly over time with like doctors, because they didn't have the knowledge of how much these things can be related, and especially because brainstem compression can affect multi-system, right? So brainstem compression is why my heart rate would be super high at times, and sometimes it would be oddly low, and it was why I would have like weird stomach problems, and like, why my vision shakes. Like there's so much that highway is in charge of. And instead of, I think that the medical system is siloed, they look at the multi-system. So, sorry, they look at systems separately. And so, I went and had my heart checked. Well, it's not your heart. Or, it's migraines, but migraines doesn't make sense because, like, why are you having all these balance issues? Maybe it's vestibular migraine. So I went from thing to thing once things were more acute. And I guess what it made me feel like is every time I don't make sense, I feel like there's going to be an extra piece of paper in my file that is going to make people wonder about my psyche. And I felt like, well, what do I do? Because my psyche is kind of one of the strongest, most reliable things I've got, but it's the thing that gets kind of pondered first. And how do I prove to people that, like, wait, like, I don't think this is in my head, like, or I'd love it to be in my head because then I could just turn it off, or I am so willful, or I am so dedicated. And I think that it's just like one of those interesting pieces where we all have different experiences, but, some of us with like chronic health is like, we kind of learn to be quiet because, it's hard enough living this way, but every time we need a resource and we don't make sense to that resource, sometimes it can feel counterproductive because, if that paper in my file goes to the next specialist who says she's fine, then how are they going to look at me? How are they going to respond to what I'm saying? And I think it's just an interesting piece where, I wanted to kind of like bring up that subject because I think that there are probably a lot of people out there like me, and maybe not with this specific problem. Maybe it's not a health problem, but like where we kind of quiet ourselves because when we do finally say something, it can get diminished or it can get so misunderstood that it can feel like it's kind of safer just to keep it to myself. And I know for me, when I had the stroke event, like that was so ingrained in me. And also I'd like to say that like brain injury can dramatically change a person's ability to self-assess. So like now I think, oh, like my eyes literally weren't syncing. I was like wearing an eye patch to be in the car because I couldn't control my eyes together. And like the physiotherapist like was like, whoa, you're like these muscles, like they're not tracking like objective data. Or my speech became dramatically bad and I was like, I couldn't produce. I was pushing the words out slowly. I'd never had that symptom before. And yet, I had to essentially get harassed by, a few family members to like go to the doctor. And so it's just an interesting piece where, I have this history of, out of necessity, learning to under-respond. And yet at the same time, I also am building this new trust in myself that like, okay, well, my legs being funny at times right now kind of makes sense and I'll wait and see. And it's kind of nice that it's not like before when I was under-responding. And it's okay to wait and it's okay to not know. And there are no guarantees, but I got a really good shot, so.